So today I'm tag teaming with Penny Jester, sitting over here also trying to work the furniture. Apparently it's quite complicated. And Penny is, together we work on IND applications here on campus, IND and IBE applications. And I look at them more from a scientific anal retentive side. And then Penny has a lot of clinical trial experience and is the director of the CRIS program and works all kinds of tasks here in the CCTS, clinical trials office, et cetera, So together we wanted to kind of go through how you apply for an IND. It is tedious, but not difficult. I think it's easier than putting together an R01 or something like that.
I think it is too. It's just answering questions.
Yeah.
You're not going to be judged. You just have to have the writing.
I know, yes.
Has anybody been involved in an IND before?
All right. Well, this will be really informal. We kind of forgot who presented first, we'll do it in a second, yeah, we'll do it together. And I brought some handouts, so when we actually go through all the parts of an IND, I'll distribute them, and I think I have enough for everybody. And then I'll pull up the documents for those of you calling in. I should be able to show you on the screen as well where we are when we discuss the document. So this is kind of the outline of what we'll talk about. What's the purpose of an IND, and what types of INDs there are, when you need one, and how do you apply for one, obviously, and then how do you manage one, and especially the latter. That's what Penny really brings a lot of expertise to the table. That's why I'm out to talk to Penny. And IDEs, investigational device exemptions, are very different to INDs. There's some minor differences, but we'll really focus on INDs today because they have the most structure to them. The FDA has really strict requirements what needs to be an IND application. There are a lot of forms associated with them. We were kind of surprised when we submitted our first IDE to the FDA. We asked, where are the forms? And they said, just send us what you think we need to know. So there was a little bit different attitude, but we got it approved. Sticking things in brains of people, apparently they're okay with that. So, but yeah, today we'll focus on INDs. Okay, you want to talk about the purpose of an IND?
Okay, so the purpose of an IND, really, the basic purpose is you just want to be able to study a new drug that hasn't been approved by the FDA. If you were to have one simple definition, that's what it would be. The FDA came into effect when people were using magic serum to treat, a cold sore. And finally, the government, people said, we need to know the products we're taking have been approved and that they work. And so that's kind of how the FDA got started. You can, again, what it is, and it's kind of a backwards way of saying it, but an IND is an exemption from the law requiring an approved marketed product can be used for clinical testing, which simply means today, if you go to the pharmacy, everything everything for the most part except for food additives. If it's a drug, it's going to be approved and licensed by the FDA, and so the FDA says you can only take drugs that are approved by us. But if you're doing a clinical research, it's not approved. So you get an IND to allow you the exemption from having FDA approval. So again, it's kind of a backwards way of saying it, but I kind of revisit that. So we assess what the FDA does is they assess the proposed clinical protocol to make sure that it is not unnecessarily risky. The FDA doesn't review your protocol to see if you're going, to really look at efficacy. They're not too worried about efficacy. They just want to know that they're protecting the population. That's your job to figure out the efficacy so we can license the drug. But for an IND, the purpose is really just to make sure it's not too risky to be given to a human being. The FDA will evaluate preclinical data for safety. They'll look at the investigator's qualifications, and again, their intent is to look at the drug for purity. So that's kind of what an IND application looks at.
So that's, I think, a point to hammer home. They won't evaluate it whether you design the study appropriately to get the result that you want. They will not look at power calculations or anything like that. They'll really purely look at safety. So keep that in mind, that getting a protocol approved by the FDA is not necessarily a guarantee that you did a good job in designing the study. It just means that it's safe.
Question, you say you. Because I am developing the drug, but I am not a physician. Obviously, I cannot put it's not qualifying to do clinical research. That means you means me and somebody like physician, right?
Yeah,
Who will
correct.
to get that also,
Right.
right?
And a lot of times, a sponsor, let's say Merck, will prepare an IND. They have a new drug, they're going to write the IND. They're going to go then out and hire a physician to conduct the study. Because you're right, the company, the PhD guy really can't give a drug to a human being. It has to be a physician. So,
Yeah, we had one instance where the PI of the IND, or the sponsor of the IND, was a PhD, and then the physician who was conducting the trial was the MD, the doctor who was actually conducting it.
and we'll kind of explain that that's the 1571,
Yeah.
1572, so that'll come out again. But that was a very good question. Okay.
The arrow down, or just hit the space bar, it's the bigger button.
I think
Oh, I think we skipped one, hold on. Did we? Yeah, here, this one.
Oh, okay. So again, you need permission to do a clinical trial. You need an IND, which is what gives you permission to go forward with the study. Again, the sponsor, as I mentioned, will be the one to apply for permission to do the study drug. We have sponsors here at UAB. We have, and then you can have a sponsor who, again, someone who's taken a drug that maybe is already licensed for adults and they want to study it in children. The company says they're willing to let them do that, so they will apply for an IND to study the drug, same drug that's licensed in adults, now to test it in children. So then the sponsor could be here at UAB, and for that, again, for the terminology. Plus the sponsor then could also be the physician conducting the study.
Yeah, and that's different, sometimes it leads to confusion. When you think of NIH grants, for example, and sponsorship, we typically think about people that pay for the study. That's a different sponsor than the sponsor in IND speak. The sponsor in IND speak is the person or the entity that signs off on that trial is under their authority. So it can be an individual, but it can also be UAB. And since we do here at UAB, we like to have UAB be the sponsor instead of the investigator themselves for liability and legal reasons, or it can be a pharmaceutical company, but it's not necessarily the institution who pays for it.
So when you think about having permission to do a study, who gives permission? So a new clinical trial. You might have the FDA, which give you permission via an IND. You'll have your IRB give you permission to do the study as well. And there may be other entities that at UAB or whatever institution you're at who would give you permission to go forward with a clinical trial. If you've done an IND study before, or if you have not, our IRB will ask for that IND number. So they kind of work together. And the FDA wants to see your IRB approval. So, you know, although they're two different entities, they know they want you to have addressed each other, so to speak. The third one is really just, it's site-specific and protocol-specific.
Yeah, like if you do radioactive study with the radioactive material, you need to have approval from our OSHA and so on as well.
And then, so it's clearly the sponsor, and as we've mentioned, who can the sponsor be? Investigator, physician, or investigator, physician. That would be somebody here at UAB, a physician, or a PhD person who's at UAB, institutional person who's going to hold the IND. Or it could just be UAB is going to hold the IND, or industry can hold the IND. Holding it means you kind of sign the 1571 and take responsibility for the entire packet that we're talking about. Yes, ma'am.
Here at UAB, does UAB hold all the INDs, or can individuals hold the INDs as well?
Both. Yeah, so it's not mandated yet, but all the INDs that go through our office are strongly encouraged to have UAB be the sponsor, just because it provides an extra set of eyes of people who sign off on it. Marquez will sign off on it as a representative of UAB. Because when you sign the cover page, which is this form 1571 that we'll go through, you legally, agree that you take full responsibility of all these kind of things like monitoring, make sure that, when there is an adverse event happens, that you immediately report that. So we've added that extra additional layer of responsibility by routing all our INDs through Dick Marquez's office. And it really is it doesn't add a whole extra lot of bureaucracy layer. We just, run the forms back and forth to Dick's office and his signature. So it doesn't add.
I think the other important thing we often get asked is, is this taking responsibility from me? Let's say I'm a physician investigator and I want this IND, I'm real excited, it's going to be my IND, and I'm going to do the protocol. But if I have Dick Marquez sign it, is that not diluting my responsibility? And it really is not. I don't think because really what happens here at UAB, if you held the IND yourself and not the institution, UAB is still going to back you up. You are an employee at UAB, and they're going to have your back no matter what. They'll support you because you're their employee. It helps the institution if they sign off and they at least have a hands-on and a knowledge that you're doing it. So it does not, would you agree with that, Mike? It doesn't take away from your responsibility nor the, again, prestige, if there is, to holding an IND. You know, it's still yours, and the institution's just, they're just your backup.
It's like comparable with the grant. If you get an R01, you know, it's OSP who signs off on actually getting the grant from NIH, whereas it's your R01. So it's very similar in that. It's a good description.
Types of INDs, there are three primary traditional types. One is sponsor-initiated. That would be you would be initiating it, or an industry sponsor, just the normal, traditional mode of doing INDs. There is emergency use, and that would be, so for example, we had one study where we had we used an emergency use IND. The scenario was we had a study with an IND that was using a high West Nile virus titer, IVIG, which is an immunoglobulin, which is in the body, is just a blood supplement, but had high titers in West Nile virus. We were testing it against a placebo, 10 years, not 10 years ago, not that long ago, close, when West Nile virus was so big in the U.S. This was a study we were doing, but it was only for people who had severe neurologic problems, which tends to be people over 40. So what happened was there was a child in New Jersey. It was a national study. It was a multi-center study around the United States, and we were coordinating it from here at UAB. We learned about a child in New Jersey who had an organ transplant. Lo and behold, the organ was infected with West Nile virus. So there was no other drug on the market. So what we were able to do was the physician in New Jersey applied for an emergency use IND to use our study product to treat the child with. So that's what an emergency use is. It's kind of off the traditional IND, but it's a drug that's being studied under an IND, but it's being used for some kind of emergency situation. And the FDA approved it, and the company has to approve it who manufactures whatever product you're using. And we had extra drug or extra IVIG, so we were able to help too. But they call it emergency use because then it's documented with the FDA, and we do try to collect some data. We did try to collect some data, though the physician wasn't required to collect anything. But they had to do the informed consent and everything. But nonetheless, it was very quick. It didn't take long. Sometimes an IND can take 3 to 6 months, depends on the type and how much information is needed. The emergency use was done within 1 week. Treatment. We actually have a study right now that we're using expanded access. And this, so it can be they call it compassionate use sometimes, or expanded access. And this is where you have a drug for one reason or another that, well, UAB has I think
that's just share.
UAB is doing a study with CBD, which is cannabis oil.
To treat epilepsy.
To treat epilepsy. They got permission from the state to bring the drug to Alabama. UAB did research. So UAB has chosen to do it under an expanded access, which means we're able to give the product or to do a research study that's not real rigorous, in the sense that we're able to get the products to the families who might need it. It's not a blinded controlled, it's totally open label, but it's kind of a watered down research study, but it's a matter of getting a drug to a population that may very well benefit from it. Sometimes cancer drugs are used that way just because there's nothing else for people, and you have a product and you're doing research, because there are research studies with this product, but in a certain environment it's better just to go for the expanded. Again, I would tell you though, the downside, if I could argue, because we're doing another drug, or another study with children using a new product that has never been used in children, we're trying to study its use. It's an antiviral. And the problem is the company has done a lot of compassionate use and expanded access use with this drug, and they have all this wonderful data. but it's not rigorous research, and it sort of has watered, it's challenging for us to do the study in a blinded, controlled manner because people have heard about it being used for expanded access. Or, you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? They know that other people have gotten it without having to jump through all the hoops that we require for our study, which is blinded. And also the data that's collected for compassionate use, emergency use, and expanded access aren't really, they may suggest some information for the package insert, but they really do not define, and they don't direct the licensure of the drug. You need a controlled, rigorous study for the FDA to approve drugs for licensure. So as you can see, emergency use, compassionate use, and expanded access are not rigorous. But if it means, and I think the expanded access actually came about, I was talking to someone about this, came about with the AIDS epidemic. When that's when it first started, they first started using it because people were so sick and there were drugs that were being developed. A good clinical trial takes 3 to 4 years. And if you're really sick, you don't want to wait 3 to 4 years. You want to figure out a way to get that drug to you because you don't have anything else. And so that's why they developed the expanded access, especially. So anyhow, more information maybe you need it, but it helps define the whole picture. And, you read these things and you learn about them and you realize the FDA really does try to meet the needs of the public. Yeah. I think that's the key. We often think of them as creating barriers to research sometimes, but they're not, I don't think. Anyhow, that's my editorial for the day. There's a new IND type, it's a phase 0, and that's where you just give a drug, usually it's 1 dose of a drug to healthy population, 2 or 3 subjects, just to get some basic pharmacokinetic information. You don't really look for safety because you're not giving them much of anything, but you're looking for how the body's going to react to that drug. So if you know about phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is a 0. So we're kind of on backwards. Approved product is required for again, let's.
So there's kind of 2 situations in which you need an IND. Sometimes what we mostly think about when you think about drug discovery and development is you have an unapproved product, a new drug that you made, and it's never seen in human, then of course you need to have an IND. So it's kind of in the left column. However, sometimes you also need an IND even if the drug has already been approved for use in humans. And that's typically, so that's stated on the right, you need an IND when you're going to study a new aspect of an approved drug. So it can be for a different indication. Let's say you develop a drug for asthma and then you see an animal model that, hey, it works for diabetes too, at least in mice. Let's test this in humans. So you need an IND to study that asthma drug now in diabetes. Different route of administration or dose, because it may change the side effect profiles and so on. Sometimes if you combine a drug with a different drug at the same time, you need an IND. And in a different population, that refers back to what Penny mentioned. Let's say a drug is approved for using adults, and you want to use it in pediatric populations, you'll need an IND for that. But, so that is not to be confused with off-label use. So approved products can be used by physicians on a case-by-case basis outside of what is approved for, just for what we call the practice of medicine. So if it's not a study for how effective this drug is to treat disease X, then any physician can prescribe any drug off-label if they think that will benefit the patient on an individual basis.
I think one example of this that worked, that really played well into an IND for us is for many years, Tamiflu there was a big black box warning on the package insert because it's already an approved drug for Tamiflu, which was given for flu. And the black box warning said, do not give to children under 1 year of age. It just don't do it. Well, we learned that doctors did it all the time. So we wanted to do a study to see what's the right dose, because children aren't the same as adults. They metabolize differently, so you can't just dose a child based on what an adult gets, so someone bigger. And the reason for the black box warning is when the drug was given 500 times the normal dose to baby rats, they had seizures. One could argue that's a little bit extreme, even though it's warning. So what we did is we did just a chart review to see what the standard of care was. And in people who we went to a number of hospitals, looked in their got permission to look in the medical records of children under 1 who received Tamiflu for standard of care. And we were able to identify that there were no serious adverse events occurring. And then we used that as evidence to send to the FDA when we wanted permission to study the drug with a new IND in younger children. So anyhow, it was a nice model to use if you ever, anyhow, just for y'all to know about and think about.
So sometimes you do not need an IND, and there are several criteria that you need to meet in order to go ahead and study a drug without needing to go to the FDA. So that's if you have no intent to support any new use or labeling change of the drug, if there's no intent to support advertising. So typically in a university setting, we're not going to create advertisements on NBC, like, with really fast people saying, like, don't take when you're pregnant. If the route of administration, dosage, or study population is changing, but it doesn't significantly increase the risk, you don't need an IND. Of course, you need to comply with informed consent, and it needs to be reviewed by the IRB. And you cannot promote or represent the product as safe or as an effective treatment for a condition under the study. If you meet all those, you don't need an IND. So we have a little quiz now. So these are case studies in our office, and we had to determine whether an IND was needed or not. So the first one was to study the therapeutic effect of a food supplement called GABA. You can buy it in the pharmacy. It's available over the counter on the purpose of type 1 diabetes. So we have to determine, do we need an IND, yes or no? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? Who thinks nothing and is too scared to raise your hands? Okay, just yell it out, yes or no? Yes. Yes? All right. Yes. Oh, brilliant. So since the therapeutic intent, you need an IND. So if you study the effect of salt water on whether it prevents ingrown hangnails, you need an IND because of therapeutic intent.
The whole thing about food supplements too is it's a growing area, and it's, there was a period of time when it was questioned whether there was a need for an IND, but in the past few years, no way, you absolutely need one. It's a growing field for sure.
So we had another one, it was one of our first ones, and the PI wanted to study the effect of a commonly used drug for the treatment of asthma on bone turnover markers. So do you prevent osteoporosis? Yes or no? What do you think?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to put some no ones in there next year. The answer is yes. So initially, we thought we could get by with an exemption, but it was not true, because if the bone turnover markers change and it reduces or increases the risk of osteoporosis with this drug, it will change the label, the package insert of the drug. Hence, you need an IND.
I guess the magic word here is study.
Yes. That's it.
So a physician will just give it because he thinks it will help, but it's not going to study.
Correct. Right. Exactly. Correct. So, yes. Yeah. And so there's guidances that the FDA gives out, so that's a link to the guidance. And then if you're still not sure, ask the IRB first. So we had a discussion with one of our PIs a few weeks ago who was baffled by the fact that the IRB actually can define whether you need an IND or not. If the IRB is okay with your study, you're going to go ahead, and you can go to FDA. So your IRB is kind of the first line of defense or offense, however you see it. So the IRB is your first kind of goalpost you need to cross, and then you can still go to the FDA and ask them. And we have actually submitted an IND before, maybe last year or so, where the FDA came back and said, really, you don't need an IND for this. Here's it back.
And it was the IRB had suggested we do it as well. So, even they don't always get it right, but they're more likely to err on the side of overcaution, which is what we want them to do anyway. So, yeah. In the end, it was a good exercise.
Yes. So, oh my God, I need to apply for an IND. The world is ending. So we just wanted to share that we're here to help, and we've done, 10, 15, something like that now. Every IND is unique in some aspect typically, but we're really learning together as we're navigating all the different types of INDs that there are. So, how to apply for an IND is fill out lots of forms. So there's 4 important ones, and we'll discuss them in detail. 1571, 1572, 3674, and 3454. So all those acronyms, you start to kind of memorize them. If you get numbers, you'll memorize them at some point. You become like names. But I think it's important before you contact us, or at least, at around the time you contact us, you really should have a pretty final clinical protocol. Because a lot of the portions from the IND come from a clinical protocol. And have that really picked around by, people in your department, have a statistician look at it. This is going to give you meaningful information, yes or no, because again, the FDA is going to review it for that angle. And also, you need to have your informed consent form available, because the FDA will want to take a look at that. They're not going to approve it without seeing your informed consent.
And they don't require IRB approval, so you don't have to have an approved consent, but they just want, because they will comment. I mean, we've had one PI and they gave us a list of 4 or 5 comments that they wanted, things they want to change from the consent side, which is always a good idea to have before you give time.
Yeah. So we still do paper submissions here on campus. There are ways to do electronic submissions now through a certain portal, but you need fancy software for that. I know all kinds of hoops to jump through that we just haven't taken the time to investigate how all that works. So we're just doing paper, and the FDA, especially from academic institutions, they still accept that, no problem. But you have to submit it in triplicate. They have really fancy binders that they like to, the FDA gives you the order number of the binders that they like to see. I guess they'll have shelves and shelves of nicely lined up binders. But this kind of shows you the difference between, on the left, that's an IND for an approved product. So it's a thick stack of papers, but not that crazy. On the right, that's a new product, it's a gene therapy product. You'll need to submit a lot more information with manufacturing information, safety data, and things like that. So I just put my one card there as a comparator, and then you have to submit these big boxes to the FDA through a UPS or something like that.
If you have, so what, there would be 3 copies of everything.
Yeah.
It has to go to the FDA, then we make a copy for the PI, and then usually keep a copy as well. Yeah. So, and then we have it all electronic as well, so we just keep everything. But it's a lot of paper. Yes.
Let's talk about pre-IND meeting real quick, because people always wonder, do I need one? So a pre-IND meeting is really a meeting with the FDA before you submit your final IND, and it's a formal way to communicate with them what your plans are. So typically, you request a meeting when you have questions about how to design your protocol, and also how to, for example, design your toxicity studies. Because they're going to review, when a new product, they will look at the toxicity data in animals to get their input, whether they view a certain design for toxicity experiments using what kind of animal, what kind of dosing schedule, and so on. Are they okay with that? So you have to formally phrase all those questions and ask what kind of expertise you want from the FDA to attend a pre-IND meeting. And they follow a kind of a ritual and a dance, and you get formal minutes from the FDA to, get in writing what they decided about that. You kind of have to have a plan of, you typically want to ask, this is what we want to do, are you okay with that, yes or no? And they'll say yes or no. They're less good about, hey, we're thinking about this, how should we design our protocol? They're not going to give you an answer on that. They're not really thinking with you.
They want you to think, and they're just going to say yay or nay.
Yeah.
Yes. One of the things important to remember is we work with a pharmaceutical company that had a new product. And they were so worried about their market share that we went through 2 pre-INDs because they wanted to make sure that they had every possible question that the FDA would ask answered before it went in for the IND, because once it goes in for the IND, it becomes a matter of record. So then one could argue that the shareholders would be able to see what problems there were with the product, or what questions the FDA had after it was officially submitted, and that might affect stock prices, which was a real surprise to me. And it seems kind of silly, but I don't own a company, so I can't really address that. But the pre-INDs, I think that bottom statement, again, the intent is to get it cleaned up and acceptable to the FDA before you submit to the full protocol. We've had one of the big issues we run into is again with the pre-IND was asking questions about, do we have enough safety? Have we addressed the safety enough? Do we have enough blood? Are we checking the blood often enough? Are we doing enough blood pressures? Those are questions that we'd ask the FDA in a pre-IND meeting to make sure we cover every possible contingency that they would see. It's good to have them behind you when you're writing protocols with new drugs. It's tedious, but after a while you begin to see the benefit because they see things we don't see. So anyhow, the pre-INDs, again, as Maaike said, it's not required, but it's really helpful, especially for kind of a real novel drug and a novel design.
And then Penny is the FDA on speed dial too. So you can also have informal communications with the FDA where she just calls up her contacts and asks them quick questions. I mean, you won't get a formal in writing response about that, but it can help you guide with some, tedious to where you might get questions. Yeah.
And as we have on here, it can be phone call and emails, yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be a formal. Oh, and just as an FYI, we went to I've been to one formal meeting at the FDA. Most of them in this day and age are phone conferences. But we were up there and I sat down at a big long table. And there were about 8 of us from UAB and about 6 people from the FDA. And I sat down and somebody came up and tapped me on the shoulder and they said, you have to sit on the other side of the table. Because it's prescribed. The FDA sits on one side and then everybody else sits on the other. So, and I think that's even in we have a master book that gives us direction and it's really documented. You sit on your own side. So, yeah, and I'm not, again, I won't even try to guess why that is.
So the application itself, it's divided up into different sections, and certain type of information goes into different sections. And the sections are the same for any IND that's received by the FDA. So it really helps them to really hone in, like, I want to look at section 5 because I want to look at the investigative brochure. So they know where to find things. So it also means that there may be some repetition. Unlike in a grant application where you typically don't want to repeat yourself verbatim, in an IND, it's perfectly fine to have similar text in the introductory statement and also in your previous human experience section. So these are the 12 sections. So section 1 is really just a form, the 5071 form, which shows who the sponsor is. Then they have a separate section for the table of contents, which once you get into applications that are this high, you can kind of imagine that the table of contents is actually several pages long. Then there's an introductory statement that kind of gives an overview of this is the molecular structure of the drug. We want to give it 2 times a day orally, and we're going to enroll 24 patients in year 1. So it's typically only 1 or 2 pages. The section 4 is the general investigational plan, so it's really more of a summary of what you plan to do. Again, it's only a few pages, with some background information why it's a good idea to study this drug in humans. In section 5, the acronyms are IB or PI, which means investigator brochure or package insert. So if you use an approved drug, you can pretty much download the PDF from the internet about, this is the package insert for Prozac, and you stick it in there in the application. If it's not an approved drug, you need to compile what's called an investigator brochure, and you only need that if you have multi-site study. If you're only studying things at UAB, you don't need an investigator brochure. But it kind of lists, why we're studying the drug and any potential side effects that you need to be on the lookout for. So it's kind of a summary document about the drug.
And it also, the IB will have any animal studies that were done with the drug too.
Yeah. Then section 6 is typically the meat, which is the protocol. So it describes all the study visits that you have, all the tests that you'll be doing, how many patients you'll enroll, how you will obtain consent, where you will keep the records, if you plan to publish it, where you're going to publish it, things like that. And then it also has a section of facilities and also about the investigator, the PI, the physician who will be doing executing the protocol. Then section 7 is the CMC, or Chemistry, Manufacturing, and Controls, and that describes how the drug was made. So typically, the new product is quite a substantial section. It describes all the SOPs for making the drug and all the testing that was done on it. Is it sterile? What's the concentration of it? What's the potency? If you test it for stability, if you stick it on the shelf, is it still as potent, a year from now as it is today? So that's a pretty extensive section. The section 8, Pharmacology and Toxicology, and that's actually something to know that those studies do not need to be done GLP, which was the pharmacology studies. Toxicology studies do, but just for studying do an animal study with the drug and see if it clears your disease, that does not need to be GLP. That can just be a research level of scrutiny. Then you have a section 9 on previous human experience. Maybe somebody in Europe did the trial with that. Well, you put that information in that section. And then there's some section for additional information that has, if you have a radioactive drug or you want to study pediatric populations, there's a few different categories that if that is applicable, you stick some information in there. And section 11 is typically not applicable to us. It's if you make a generic antibody or something like that. And in section 12 is a form, clinical trial certificate of compliance, which is that you registered your trial with clinicaltrials.gov. And again, that's where Penny is the master of clinicaltrials.gov, how to deal with all that.
I missed, what is section 11?
It's a user, it's for people, let's say you want to make a generic Herceptin, like an antibody against HER2. So it's only when you want to make generic biological drugs.
What means fee?
To be honest, it's never been applicable to us, so I haven't looked into it. I think it's maybe a pricing structure.
I think there's a fee that you pay to the FDA, and I'm really curious as to see how this, when we get one. I'm anxious to do it.
Yeah, we haven't done one yet.
I don't totally understand it.
Actually, that is the biosimilar, means when we are making very similar product identified, but generic, that is only applies to the generic, not for the investigational later. Making the copy of the same product. That's the generic product.
And there is some sort of fee that has to go to the FDA. That's all about.
Yeah, with any of our INDs, you don't have to pay. You don't even have to pay us. We're here. Well,
Somebody pays us, but it isn't you guys.
So we created a template to really make your life as easy as possible, and it contains some of the stock language that you can use. It has links to forms, and I have them with me.
And we have it electronic as well,
Yes.
so that you can, it comes as a Word, and you can just, if you are starting an IND, we send it to you, and you just start filling it in, and then we help you clean it up and send it off. So if you look at this, I think, we'll just kind of put, so that Maaike shares some of the different categories. And again, keep in mind that there is repetition, as she said, and what happens at the FDA is one person will get section 1, one person section 2, one person section 3. So that's kind of one reason there's so much redundancy, because a lot of people have their hands on it and want to go to different sections.
So there's a few forms that are attached to your the Word printout, and I printed it kind of small because I didn't want to kill too many trees. But let's go through kind of the 2 pages on 1 page form, and it's printed kind of weird, like from right to left. We have a new printer. I don't know. Okay.
Not cooperating.
No. So you kind of have a cover sheet. So it just, says, what's the title of your application, what's the name of my product, and that the sponsor is actually the Board of Trustees of the University of Alabama for the University of Alabama, Birmingham. It's the legal name of UAB. That's way too long, but yeah, that's kind of the official name. And then we include a cover letter.
The question that, for example, UAB Vaccine Center, is it also UAB?
It would be UAB, yes. Yeah.
And just so you know, when we have it electronically, everything yellow, it's highlighted yellow, the things you should replace, so that it makes it easy to find what you need to focus on.
So then the first section, section 1, is the 1571. So that's the form that looks like this. So it pretty much says, the name and the address of the sponsor. It's all pretty self-explanatory. The name of the drug, the IND number. Sometimes you don't know it yet because you haven't gone to the FDA yet. But if you have a pre-IND meeting, you will have been assigned an IND number. The indication, and there's a few, check boxes like what clinical trial phase are you doing here. And then if you look at box 11, you can pretty much check, hey, this is a new IND. Or if you send in the progress report, you check the appropriate box. So on the back in section 13, these are all the different sections that you typically submit to the FDA. So section 1 through 12. So it's kind of almost a table of contents, and you typically submit all of that, although sometimes you only submit a protocol and maybe a few other things. And then ultimately, Dick Marquet signs off under 17 and 18. So, this kind of the legalese, and we take care of getting all that signed for you just to make your life easier. Okay. So in section 2, it's a table of contents. I created a template using Word and automatic headers and footers and headings and things like that, so it automatically updates. So it just kind of makes your life easy again. In section 3 on page 3.7 is the introductory statement. So that's kind of what I described. This is where you do a quick overview. This is the name of my drug. It's an antihistamine, and we're going to treat, asthma or whatever you want to do. This is the formulation. This is how much we're going to give, and we're going to give it via injection, intramuscular or whatever. And then there's just a few summary sections. So typically, this is really not more than 2 pages or so when you fill in all the information. Then section 4 is a general investigational plan. So this is where you need to provide the rationale why it's a good idea to test the drug in humans. So typically, you provide some background on the science, maybe a few key animal experiments that show that you cure cancer, and that's a good idea to use it now in human patients with cancer. And you kind of do the general approach. These are the parameters that we'll be looking at, and we'll be administering it, this often, and this is how many patients we'll enroll. Okay.
I think one of the key things to note is under like 4.7 where it says references, that those are references that would refer to everything in this section. And you don't, again, we'll talk about references at the very end, but just know that these are references that would be used for section 4.
Yeah, it's like when you write a paper, it's just where the references go that you refer to. In section 5, we talked about it already, so the package insert or investigator brochure. So sometimes you don't need it if you only do study here. So that makes life easy. And then I provided some stock text so that you can just copy and paste or change out so you don't have to come up with everything from yourself. In section 6, the protocol, like we talked about, so we have all these subheadings in here just to make sure that you hit all these things. What is your recruitment strategy? What are your eligibility and inclusion and exclusion criteria? Those kind of things. Many times you just get a protocol from the PI and we'll just stick it in, as a separate document. But we do kind of cross-check where you hit all these points that are highlighted here in your table of contents. So then we get to section 6.2, which is investigator facilities data. So that's where you get to your second form, which is your 1572.
And so this is what whoever is conducting the clinical trial, who's seeing the patients at your site, they're going to sign the 1572. On the 1571, Dr. Maaike signs it. This could be you if you're also, holding the IND and you're going to see your patients. We do have one investigator on campus who, discovered the drug, investigated the biologic that he was using. And for that reason, because of conflict of interest, he could hold the IND at UAB, but he could not be on the 1572 because of the potential conflict of interest. If he invented it, he's going to be the one making money, so we don't want him interacting with patients. So he could not be on this form. He could only do this 1571. So we had to get another doctor to sign this. And
not just sign it.
Oh, yeah. That's right. More than a signature. And this form sort of gives a description to the FDA of where the patients will be seen, what's the pharmacy, what's the IRB, who are the sub-investigators, and then on the back is a place for the signature, which says the person conducting the study with the human subjects will adhere to all of these 9 criteria. And this is truly one of those documents that if you sign it, it's a legal document. And you could lose your license, you could go to jail if you don't do what's said under the commitments under Section 9. Again, just as a little aside, if you read Section 9, you need a team to help you do any research study. Not one person can do all of this.
Okay, then we'll stick in the CV of the PI. Again, a little bit formatting, because it gets such a kind of a pain in the rear to have all the, and then your figures start jumping in your Word document, and you want to throw the computer out the window. We help you with all of that. So we'll be the one yelling at the computer, and we don't have to. It's our service. All right, so then we have a form called the 3454, which is the certification, financial interest, and arrangements of clinical investigators.
And this is the one that Dr. Maaike will also sign off on. And everybody that's listed on the 1572 will also be on this form. And we will make a point of sending them each an email to make sure they don't have any conflict of interest, that they don't have any financial investments in the drug that's being studied. They send an email back and we share it with Dr. Maaike and he signs the form. But again, we just want to make sure that anybody who's seeing patients that is not going to have a financial gain from the study. So that's what that form helps us tell the FDA that we need that.
Then we have a section about the facilities, and again, we have some start language for both UAB, the Children's Hospital, and some other, as we get a few more INDs of different facilities on campus, but we can provide you with that. And then section 6.3, that's where you put the IRB approval and consent form. Again, you don't need to have IRB approval, but we typically say, this is currently under review, if that's the case, but here's the informed consent form, because the FDA will always ask for that. So we'll put that in there. All right, so section 7 then is the CMC section, or chemistry, manufacturing, and control. So what happens a lot is if you're studying a drug that's already being approved, and the company has said, hey, it's okay if you're going to study this drug in a new population or for a new disease, what they'll do is they'll send a letter of cross-reference to the FDA where they say, okay, FDA, it's okay to look at our files to show you how we're making the drug. And that way, you don't have to submit all that when you're submitting your IND to the FDA. So it saves a lot of paperwork, and that's why if you have an approved drug, typically the pile of papers is very smaller than when you have a new drug, because they just cross-reference it. But the company needs to give you approval for that, because they're confidential documents, so the FDA can just not willy-nilly go into anybody's documents and look them up, so they need to have permission for that.
And another reason for getting a letter of cross-reference is that some of the pharmaceutical companies probably don't want to share all their, manufacturing information to us. They want to keep it confidential. So this is one way to assure that the FDA can review it, but we don't need to review it. It's not anything that's going to make a difference in our protocol.
Yeah. And the same goes for section 8, pharmacology and toxicology. Typically, if you're using a approved drug, there's a whole file on file at the FDA with animal experiments, toxicology data in previous, in other clinical studies. So again, the letter of cross-reference really helps there. Okay. Section 9, same thing, previous human experience. If you use a new drug, then, that will be answered. Not people, so we don't have anything.
And I think that's an important point, because you'll notice in section 10 and 11, having the headings there and just saying not applicable helps the FDA. It's like you said, if you don't answer it, they don't know. So if we have the heading of radioactive drugs, you're not using radioactive drugs, we keep it in here, but we would just say, no, it is not applicable to this study. And that would be the same on section 11, the biosimilar. User B coverage sheet, even though we don't know whatever that is. We want someone to come up with a study so we can use it.
Yeah. All right, so then section 12 is your last form. This is the Penny Jester form. The clinical trials that go.
Yeah, this is used to determine if your study is required to be reported on registered on clinicaltrials.gov and have results reported. Has anybody used ct.gov? It is a required, it started in 2007. The government decided they wanted every clinical trial, and again, they started with more rigorous requirements, and now they're expanding it to include everything, but posted for the public to see. You think about it, let's say you're in a research study on, on heart failure, and you wonder, you get to the end of the study and you don't know what the results are. Well, you could go out and buy a medical journal, but you're not medical. You're a teacher, and that's not your realm of understanding. So the thought was, if people participate in research, they should have a right to see what the results are of that research. So that was one of the reasons for building clinicaltrials.gov, because as the public, I could go in and look up my research study after it was over and see what the results were. Because they're really reported in a very simple manner that most of the public would understand. And the other issue is, and just to go off on a little tangent, there was a study that was done recently. Again, one of the other reasons for CT.gov is exemplified by a recent study where over 15,000 studies that were done, only half of them were published. What happened to the rest of them? They don't get published because it's not interesting research and a journal doesn't want to publish it. They don't get published because maybe the investigator only enrolled half the subjects and there's nothing to he or she doesn't feel they have anything to report. But this is all of that is very important information. And just because you can't find a journal to publish your paper, maybe you're not a good writer, but we still need the information out in the public because the public has committed to being part of research. So that's another reason to get everybody to at least report on clinicaltrials.gov, even if you don't get it into a manuscript. I hope that makes sense. And I have to tell you, when we first started it was CT.gov in 2009. It was a pain in the butt. We all hated it. We thought, what a waste of time and energy. And sadly, I don't think it is. I know young investigators who go to the site, and because you can find research designs, and let's say they want to study diabetes, and maybe with a certain drug or with a certain age population, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can do a search, and you can see what other people have done, because not only does it have the results, but it'll give a brief study design. And so it can be a useful tool as well for investigators.
And I guess patients can look up if there's a study open.
That's right, for marketing, in a way. It can, we've had people call us, the GABA study.
Yeah.
I had somebody call from New York, they'd seen the study on clinicaltrials.gov, and they were very interested in participating. I don't know if the commute was going to be too much, but at least it was there.
Give your $50 gas cards. All right, because of time, let's kind of hit our last few slides. So after you submit an IND, what can happen? So there's a few scenarios. One is that, the one that always happens is that you get a receipt from the FDA, an acknowledgement letter. We've received your stuff. So typically it arrives 1 or 2 weeks, comes by snail mail. Sometimes they fax it, I think, but you still get a paper copy. And that letter gives you your IND number, and it gives you what we call the date of receipt, and it reminds you of all the obligations that you have. So that letter is not an approval to begin with. When you first got the letter, like, oh, we got the FDA letter, we're good. No. That's just, we received your stuff, we're going to look at it. So if you don't hear anything else, you can start the study until 30 days after that receipt date that's mentioned in the letter. So you don't get it like, you're good to go. It's just silence means go ahead, which is a little weird.
That's what the regulations say. Now, they are pretty good at sending a letter at 30 days. We found recently they're really good at just sending a notice that there's a no hold. That's what they say. They don't approve it, but it's not being held back. You can go forward.
Yes.
But they don't have to. By law, they don't have to send you anything at 30 days. I would encourage you, though, to get something. We had a study that we thought was good to go at 30 days. We started it, and in 45 days, we get the letter telling us we can't go forward. Now, I find we didn't get in trouble, but one could have argued it was FDA's fault because we were abiding by this 30-day window. But truly, I think since then, I've made sure that we just contact the person to whom we sent and said, okay, but we haven't gotten anything yet. You send me a note, and they will. Yeah. But by law, they don't have to.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few actions that the FDA can take. So they may want to have some additional information. This has happened to us on a few occasions where they place the IND on what we call a clinical hold. So you cannot start the study then until you've addressed all the concerns that are acceptable to the FDA. So we had, one instance where there were issues with this informed consent form. They wanted to have certain toxicity data from the animal studies in the consent form to really be as transparent as possible to see what we saw in monkeys, things like that. Typically, we don't get any holds, though. We may get some questions, and they say, you can go ahead, but we still want you to address these things. But in most cases, things sail through pretty easily.
And if they do that, you can address those, that you can still start the study and then address the things. And we would encourage anybody, if the FDA wants you to change a paragraph or change something, if you think you can do it without it disrupting the scientific progress of the study, then do it. You want to say yes to the FDA as much as you can. And if you have to push back, have strong justification, because sometimes you have to. They don't always know everything. They don't always know the science. They try to, but they're not in the field like you all are. Yes. So you can push back, but whenever you can say yes, say yes.
And then they can also conclude, like it happened in one case, that the study is actually exempt. That thank you for all this information, but we really didn't want it. You go do your study without an IND. And then what we said, typically it's passive activation. So if you don't hear anything, you're good to go. So common reasons for a hold are these bullet points. So it's all about risk, typically. So they think that the risk is unreasonable, or they just don't have enough information to assess it, or they think the protocol is just not designed correctly. Investigator brochure or the consent form can be misleading, or the clinical investigators are not up to snuff. The last point we've never had to deal with.
No. And usually what they look for is just to see if an investigator is barred. That way they look, there's a master database to see if you've been prohibited from practicing medicine or conducting research. I think this is the last. I think it is. Okay, good. Oops. So after you've gotten your your IND approved, do you need to do anything? Yes, you do. The key is there'll be an annual report. You have to submit it within 60 days of the anniversary date of the approval, or the non-full date. So 30 days after the receipt date. Again, it's a pretty simple form. Really what they're looking for in this form is safety issues. They want you to address any SAEs, AEs, and any changes to the protocol. We have a template that if you get an IND, you can use it. It's really, really not hard. During the life of a study, you may have an SAE occur, a serious adverse event. It only needs to be reported in real time, because otherwise you would report it just at the end of the year in the annual report. But if it's related, unexpected, and serious, then the FDA wants to hear about it in 15 days. Because there may be other studies going on with that drug, and they like to keep all this information current. And again, many times your investigator brochure or your package insert is going to have a list of what they expect to happen in the study. What are the adverse events you can expect? And that's all fine, because they've been determined to be reasonable expectations. But if it's outside of that, if it's a new event, if it's something nobody else has ever seen, and you think it's related to the drug, then you need to report it to the FDA in a short period of time. And that's part of the IND. Again, keeping documents up to date, IRB approvals up to date. You need to keep your medical license up to date for the doctor, whoever has a 1572 should have a medical license. A lot of documents just to keep timely and current. One of the things we talk about is monitoring. Does anybody know what monitoring is? Site monitoring. That's when an independent person comes to, you've got a study you've been doing for 6 months, and somebody from the outside, somebody independent of your office comes in to make sure that you are capturing all of your SAEs or AEs, that you are recording the data correctly. They're just doing a QC, really, of what you've been doing in the course of your study. To make sure that when you go to submit the data because after the IND you might get a new drug application completed if you have enough data, but the FDA is going to want to see your data at some point, and you want it to be clean. I mean, that's all we're talking about with monitors, making sure you have really clean data. And so they come in just to say, this doesn't look right, or how come everybody's blood pressure is exactly the same, and hopefully you won't have one of those.
Where this independent comes from?
Well, if you
supposed to hire one, or is it just come
UAB, so right now, what the ideal would be, if you had lots of money, you could hire someone to do it. If you're here at UAB right now, because UAB is supporting the IND, we have people on campus who can come and be a monitor for you, can monitor your study.
So they're still UAB employees, but they're just not in your chain of command and not in UAB.
So you don't have any influence over them.
Can't fire them. And then I think the last part, a data and safety monitoring board, for some of the bigger studies, typically a DSMB is put together. For the smaller studies, it can just be an individual person, where somebody will look at the data at regular intervals just to make sure that everything's kosher. So that's how you submit an IND. Like I said, it's tedious, but it's really not hard. If you have the clinical protocol and your scientific rationale why you want to study this in humans, you're in good shape, and we can help you put together this Word document with jumping figures and references and all that kind of good stuff. So our contact information, you probably have mine. Penny's is here at the top. And like I said, I look at things from a scientific perspective and making sure that I help with a lot of formatting. Penny really looks at it with a clinical eye and can also, looking at the protocol, many times she's picked up like, this is really not a logical way to do the study because of the nurses, the order of things, it just looks, mess up everything. Why don't you do it this way? So she can really help you with the design of the study as well.
And we're available to help with the whole protocol, or if you just want to talk about something you want to do. We're not, like I say, we're supported by the institution, so we're one thing that's free.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. Next week is our last lecture about toxicology. So hope to see you then. And enjoy this beautiful spring weather. We should all play hooky and go home. Too much to do. Thank you. You're welcome.
Joanne, what's setting up for any quarterly meetings, or what is she on now?
So because she's been funded by an R01, it's kind of I mean, it's still an 80-day portfolio, but she's meeting regularly with Mark Sudo and kind of get things going. So I've had the, impression that it's just, she doesn't really need those quarterly meetings
Okay.
as much because, they're just cranking along and it's going well. So I think they've made